Greetings, everybody. Welcome. Welcome, my friend. It's good to see you out there. Okay, there we go. Welcome, everybody, to our Thursday Bible study session, where we're in the middle of a series now. We've just begun one, actually, on the book of Daniel, where we're actually going through and, at least in the first two studies, going in deep on the background, the immediate context. Let's just dive right into the review. Let's not waste any time. It's good to see you folks here. Let me just say hello to Seth the Saxon, who's out there keeping things under control. Maximilian is with us. Thank Bud's there. Rob Tick, good to see you out there. Eddie Vasquez, what's up, man? Good to see you. Of course, Hamburger Life is with us. Excellent. Good to see you out there. Mike Nino says it's midnight here in Kenya. Kenya. Let's put another pin in the map. Thanks for being here. It's good to see you. Welcome. So, of course, as you know, we're worldwide. We're worldwide here. I guess everyone on the internet's worldwide, but anyway. Okay. Let's get into what we've got for you today. I have an outline for you, as usual, on these Bible studies. As we do these, we have an outline. Let me pull this up over here for you. As we get into chapter 3 today, part 3 and chapter 3. Oh, there you go. There's also there's a link on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. It'll take you to this screen where you can donate live if you like. Look at that. Right on cue. Paul's Deep. Paul's Deep has used the Super Chat option, which is also available in the live chat. You can see there's a Super Chat option in the chat box. You see a little $sign for as long as YouTube allows us to do that anyway. I can't imagine that's going to last much longer. Videos like I put out yesterday, I don't know. We'll see. We'll hope that they're going to be fair. All right, and let us ask questions. But anyway, today we're here for a completely different reason. Thank you, Paul. Paul's Deep says, thanks for all the vids, Brad. Glory be to God. Peace and blessings. Amen. I agree. Thank you, my brother. And, of course, very quickly, we do have some fun stuff. On that link at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there's also a little merch button up there. You can see some cool T-shirts we have here. Not a big deal. We're just trying to, promote the name of the channel, or actually the ministry, which is Armor of Truth. Okay. Links in the description for those who want to support. There's a PayPal link as well and a Patreon. So thank you very much for all your support, folks. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here doing this work. So thank you. And all the glory goes to God, of course, because without His grace, we don't do anything. We can't do anything. So here is your outline for today. Book of Daniel, part 3. And we will be in chapter 3 today, flaming persecution, or the flames of affliction. So there you can see what we're going to do today. We're going to have a short review for you, and then we're going to preview chapter 3 by looking at some articles. There you see, Aramaic memories of Daniel recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll look at the article about that from biblicalarchaeology.com. Once again, all links are for you in the description. Quite a few, well, links and sources for the whole study will be listed in the description of this video. And for a scholarly paper from the American Oriental Society about the fiery furnace. Now, this is going to be a purely secular view based on some archaeology, but we can check it out and see what they have to say. And then we'll get into the actual chapter. We'll look at the immediate context as we normally do. Of course, the text of Scripture. These chapters in Daniel are pretty short. Allows us to go ahead and read the whole thing, all in context, and then go back and look at do exegesis and look at commentary and see what we think about what we've read, and how do we place it into the context, and then, of course, how do we apply it to our lives, if at all. And so that's what we'll do in part 3 there, and then, of course, we'll do a review of what we learned today when we finish with that. This one probably won't be as long as the first two. The first two had to be pretty long because there was a lot of background information to get covered. We might move a little faster today, but I'm not making any promises about that. All right, so let's get into our review. Let's talk about what we've learned so far. Of course, if we go back to part 1, we're understanding about the book of Daniel is basically in 2 parts. We've got history and prophecy. God gives us prophecy in 5 ways. Of course, we could just do this, can't we? Take you back to the beginning. God gives us prophecy in 5 ways. The first category is through figures, types, and symbols. You definitely see that in the book of Daniel. Through promises, through parables, through direct revelation, and through story and allegory. So we see at least 3 of these in the book of Daniel. We discussed in part 1 about special revelation. What does the Bible have to say about special revelation? Which would be, special revelation is God's word and miracles and prophecies from the prophets. And the prophetic significance of Daniel. The prophecies are divided up into 4 sections. And they more or less, well, we'll get it. I'll save that point for later. And we've been looking also, of course, at the ancient Near East, trying to understand what was the religion that was in place, because these Hebrews were taken there and they were trained up in the ways of the Babylonian Empire. That's what they, at least the Daniel and his 3 friends who we follow through this book of Daniel anyway. That's what we find. That's where they were taken, to be trained up, to be astrologers and magicians. These men of God. So they were in a mess from the start. All right, and of course, last week in chapter 2, one of the important things we did last week was we looked at, first of all, the shift in language in the book of Daniel from chapter 2 to the end of chapter 7, where it goes from being written in Hebrew to Aramaic, the underlying text, of course, would be Aramaic. And some people say that this is because this is specifically telling a Gentile history, and Aramaic was the language of the Gentiles at that time in that region. So that was an important point. We talked about that. And last week was very interesting. We learned, we talked about Joseph in Egypt with Pharaoh and interpreting his dream. And because he interpreted the dream, Pharaoh found favor in him or favored him and put him over a great portion of his empire, which is what happened to Daniel as well. And we studied divination, understanding how the folks in the ancient Near East thought about divination or astrology and magic and ritual and the gods. Because in the book of Daniel, we have a lot of prophecy, we have dream interpretation, and these things are considered divination in one respect. In the pagan world, you would have to do rituals, divination, to get these answers. Servants of God, God just works through them, gives them the answer, or gives them the vision. No divination needed. Direct revelation, which is one of the ways that God gives prophecy. And of course, that's why we learned that deductive divination was forbidden, because that's where you get into reading the entrails of fish, actual things like that, extipacy and things like that, rituals, specific rituals. All right, and here we are today. Let's see, I've got for our study today. Let's see, now we've got one more piece of review here. Critical, here we go. Now, between the vision of Nebuchadnezzar in the 2nd chapter and that of Daniel in the 7th, 4 narratives of Daniel's and his friends' personal history are introduced. As the 2nd and 7th chapters go together, so do the chapters, the 3rd and the 6th chapters, and the 4th and 5th chapters go together. We pointed that out a moment ago. It comes in 4 stages in the book. Of these last 2 pairs, the former shows God's nearness to save his saints when faithful to him. At the very time they seem to be crushed by the world power, the second pair shows, in the case of the 2 kings in the first monarchy, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, shows how God can suddenly humble the world power even in the height of its insolence, at the height of its evil, at the height of its own perceived power. God can end it. And that's what we see in Daniel. We see a very good example of haughtiness being humbled more than once. And the latter examples advance from mere self-glorification in the 4th chapter to open opposition to God in the 5th chapter. Nebuchadnezzar demands homage to be paid to his image, is what we'll find here in chapter 3, and boasts of his own power in the next chapter, in chapter 4. But King Belshazzar goes even further. We'll see him later on in the book of Daniel, blaspheming God by polluting his holy vessels. There is a similar progression in the conduct of God's people. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to pay homage to the constructed image of the world power, the one that Nebuchadnezzar sets up here in chapter 3. And Daniel will not yield. He will not yield even a negative homage by omitting for a time the worship of God. They just continued right on worshiping the one true living God in defiance of the king's order, which we'll see shortly. Jehovah's power manifested for the saints against the world in individual histories. You see this in the 3rd through the 6th chapters. And this is exhibited in the 2nd and 7th chapters as well. In the worldwide prophetical pictures, the former heightening the effect of the latter. The miracles wrought in behalf of Daniel and his friends were a manifestation of God's glory in Daniel's person as the representative of the theocracy before the Babylonian king, who defended himself almighty, at a time when God could not manifest it in his people as a body. They tended also to secure, by their impressive character, that respect for the covenant people on the part of the heathen powers, which issued in Cyrus the Great's decree, not only restoring the Jews, but ascribing honor to the God of heaven and commanding the building of a new temple. Okay, now, let's see. Now, let's go here for a minute as we preview our chapter today. We've got some interesting articles here. Aramaic memories of Daniel recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the things we've been doing here in this series is showing how archaeology, how scholarship just continues to prove what the Bible has said to be not just true, but you can see that it happened. We have hard evidence for these things now. So Daniel is unique in the Hebrew Scriptures for several reasons. The book is a linguistic hybrid, as we've covered, of Aramaic and Hebrew. Its collection of court tales and apocalypses are saturated in dream visions. The story is set in the days of the Babylonian court. The scribal convergence of these traditions likely took place in the mid-Second Temple period. Yet all of these features that make Daniel, at first, out of step with most other books of the Hebrew Scriptures, make it an ideal fit within ancient Jewish Aramaic literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This set of literature, too, comes from scribal cultures of the Second Temple era. Many of its scenes feature apocalyptic outlooks and revelations, which would definitely, we got a taste of that in chapter 2, but that's going to ramp up. That's going to be most of the theme throughout the rest of what we'll cover in Daniel is going to be apocalyptic outlooks and revelations. The tales told are often set in the recent exilic past, or in their own time when they're there in the captive, when they're held in the Babylonian captivity. In some cases, we also find evidence of the rare linguistic exchange between Aramaic and Hebrew. All right, let's see here. The Qumran, that's the area in the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The Qumran Aramaic collection, however, revealed a yet unknown and broader profile of the figure of Daniel in several works. While we were familiar with other Daniel traditions from the so-called additions in the Septuagint, Cave 4 at Qumran included at least 2 new works that cast Daniel in the new settings and associate him with fresh revelations. These so-called pseudo-Daniel fragments help us see that Daniel's persona in ancient Judaism extended well beyond the 12-chapter book received in the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. So what's been found out from these findings and research is that they've learned more about who Daniel was and his character. In other words, just confirming more and more over time, these people are real. Their experiences happened. So in this episode, this is a Dead Sea Scrolls shorts at the biblicalarchaeology.org website, which I've left some links in the description for. I encourage you to check it out. So in this episode, anyway, they dove into these 4 fragments and reintroduce. They take a fresh look at the book of Daniel. He says, in a way, this figure is familiar, speaking of Daniel, yet we have the opportunity to encounter him in a literary space that was until recently foreign to us. So what did the ancients know about Daniel that we did not? And here's actually a link to this full episode here. This needs to be in the links. This needs to be right there in the. Yeah, just bear with me. I got to put that link in the description here for you guys. That's a good one. I forgot to put that one in there. That one's important. Let's put that one in there. That'll be down here in the description. It'll be down. The links are close to the bottom. This one will be at the very bottom. I'll just add it on to the end. Daniel. I'll just say it's Daniel evidence from Dead Sea Scrolls. Daniel evidence from Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, that one's in there with the link to that YouTube video. All right. Now, back to where we were. All right. Here's a suggestion. To take your study of the pseudo-Daniel fragments further, be sure to download Dr. Perrin's article on the memory of Daniel at Qumran, including the open access volumes, which I've just left the link to at the bottom of the description box. So once again, archaeology, scholarship, it's not out there proving anything that the Word of God is not true. It's out there proving that it is true. Now, here over on JSTOR, we've got a piece of scholarly work for you here. In other words, a peer-reviewed journal, scholarly journal article from the American Oriental Society, volume 128, number 1, from January through March 2008. And this piece is from pages 85 to 180 to 104. Of course, I won't read it all, but this link, can't really share this link because you have to be, this one you have to have an account to read these journal articles. But you can go, of course, you can, if you want, you can go to jstor.org, and you can access these. You can access a certain amount of these a month for free. But anyway, let's see what. Now this is secular. This is really from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, to be specific. Tawny L. Holm has put this piece together called "The Fiery Furnace in the Book of Daniel and the Ancient Near East." So we're getting a secular perspective here. And let's see what it said here. The Aramaic court conflict story of Daniel chapter 3, the only one of the Daniel stories in which Daniel does not appear. His companions, here called by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, have risen so high in the government that they have been appointed as administrators over the province of Babylon. They are denounced by rival officials for not obeying Nebuchadnezzar's command during a state ceremony to bow down to the colossal golden statue he's made, and are thus condemned by Nebuchadnezzar to die in what the underlying text, word for word, says, a furnace of blazing fire. And you can see the Hebrew transliteration of that Aramaic right here. That's pretty small, though, isn't it? This furnace is heated 7 times hotter than usual, so that the men who bind the 3 and throw them in are themselves burned to death. However, after divine intervention, 3 Jewish men come forth from the furnace unharmed, and are promoted even further into the administration of Babylon, while Nebuchadnezzar declares it unlawful to worship any god except the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As Carol Vendertorn has noted, Otto Ploger's judgment of this lively story cast many years ago is still true. Punishing by burning remains unusual. Punishing by burning remains unusual. Thus, the search for a background to the motif of the fiery furnace has led in many directions. One of the reasons why this particular story might be difficult to prove is because this wasn't a common way of executing people. And as we'll learn later, it's most likely the furnace, it just makes sense that the furnace would have been there as a way to cast the very statue that Nebuchadnezzar had just put up. It was a metal statue. So that's what the furnace could have been for. It wasn't necessarily there as an execution or torture device. It is not that burning as a capital penalty in the ancient Near East was unknown, far from it. Burning as punishment for crimes can be found especially in historical inscriptions and legal documents across the Near East, and also in metaphorical references as an eschatological punishment in specifically Israelite and Egyptian literature. However, the use of a furnace in these instances is much more rarely found. In fact, the evidence seems to demonstrate that in spite of the Mesopotamian setting of Daniel 3, the nearest parallels to the story are found in Egypt, in the literature of Egypt, particularly in late Egyptian or Demotic tales, with a court setting from the second half of the first millennium BC, in which it is the courtiers who displease a king who are condemned to die in a furnace. In the Bible, one observes the following examples of a legal execution by fire. In Genesis 38, verse 24, burning is the suggested punishment for Tamar's presumed adultery. In Leviticus 20, it is to be the punishment for a man who marries a mother and daughter together. Naughty, naughty. Of course, I don't know, back in those times, it could have been a type of arrangement, social arrangement. Who knows? In other words, listen, my response there is a very common, you need to point that out and highlight that, because often we like to take our Western perspective and put it on top of these people who lived, in some cases, 3,500 years ago. You can't do that. That's not how it works. You have to be a little more careful about that. But anyway, and Leviticus 21 prescribes immolation. It prescribes immolation for the daughter of a priest who prostitutes herself. These crimes all fall under the category of offenses against a hierarchical superior. So this is what happens to you. Of course, I guess it makes sense. The most severe punishment comes when you offend the state god, who would be the king or the representative. Let's see, because they had their own gods, small g. Tamar against her husband, the sexual athlete directly against God, and the priest's daughter against her father as examples of that. In addition, in Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah's letter of prophecy has Yahweh say that Nebuchadnezzar will roast two prophets, Ahab and Zedekiah, in the fire for false prophecy and other sins. Furthermore, John Collins also observes that burning became the eschatological punishment par excellence in post-exilic prophecy and apocalyptic literature. So it seemed to catch on. That's what he's saying after this. However, none of these particular references refers to a furnace. So it still seems that the furnace is unique. And that is why it might be as we think through the text and we learn about the context, it seems to make sense that since throwing someone in a furnace wasn't typically the way executions were done, that perhaps this was just an opportunity Nebuchadnezzar had as a result of just forging his huge metal statue. So he had this furnace, or maybe many of them, right there on hand. Another proposal has been that the author of Daniel 3 is taking literally the metaphorical use of burning in a furnace for purification or refining. Okay, so that would be the less literal view, of course. As found in the biblical Psalms or in other biblical description of Israel's sufferings in the Exodus or exile. In these cases, the terms used for furnace are usually this Hebrew word here, the underlying Hebrew word, which is kur, which means a smelting furnace, or tanur, a brick oven for baking. Some more Aramaic words and examples here. Carol Vander Torn prefers to cite as an attractive solution to the tale of the fiery furnace. These examples from Deuteronomy 4, 1 Kings 8, and Jeremiah 11, where Egypt is metaphorically reckoned an iron blast furnace. Collins, while not proposing it as a single solution, follows Dahoud's translation of Psalm 21 to suggest that the fiery furnace was readily imagined as an instrument of destruction. The phrase, "you put them as into a blazing furnace," followed by, "and fire will devour them," refers to what Yahweh will do to his enemies as well. So, now this is a pretty interesting article. So if you want to get yourself access to JSTOR, there's interesting articles that people have written about this, archaeological, scholarly articles, research articles. You can learn a lot. You can be edified by reading secular, even what the secular sources have to say. In fact, you can be more edified by reading the what the secular sources have to say, because unknowingly, perhaps in many cases, they're proving the Bible true over time. Of course, we don't need them to prove it true, but for those who are skeptical out there, it certainly does help to have these unrelated scholars. Anytime you're doing research, it's really beneficial to your argument if you can use the claims and evidence of those who hold an opinion opposed to your own to help make your own case. It just makes your case stronger. So those are the two articles I wanted to share with you today that are pretty interesting. Those are, once again, linked for you in the description. Now, let's get on over here to Daniel chapter 3. Let's get right into our study today. Let me start out by saying, let's look at some graphics here I didn't do this in the review. Once again, just to review where we are in space and time. Okay, we're about 600-700 years before the birth of Christ here, and this is the area we're talking about here. This is the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. Of course, this is North Africa over here, Egypt. Got Iraq and Iran here. This would be the old Persian Empire over here, so we know where we are in space and time. And Turkey up here, modern-day Turkey. Here's India peeking in over here, coming in on the east. So that's where we are. We're in this dry, arid region here, which is, of course, fed by rivers, of course. The plains, flat plains area. But over here in Media and Persia, where there are more, where Iran is today, it's way more mountainous. A little bit of Iraq too, but a lot of mountains over here. So when Nebuchadnezzar's wife came from this area here, where she was used to seeing mountains and trees and streams, and when he took his Median wife down here to Babylon in these flat, arid plains, she was not happy with that. So Nebuchadnezzar, great husband that he is, built his wife a mountain. And that was what came to be known as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which are represented, depicted anyway, here. Perhaps that's what it looked like. Here's a modern representation in Iraq of what someone has built to maybe resemble Hanging Gardens of Babylon, just an artificial mountain, I guess is the way to look at it. Of course, last couple weeks we've looked at, or the week one we looked at the ziggurat, how it's different from a pyramid in function. It's not a tomb. It's a home for the state god. So in Nebuchadnezzar's time, this might have been, if this was one of their ziggurats, this might have been where Marduk resided. The people and the profane people were not allowed here. Only the priests could come here and take care of Marduk's house. The temples for worship were typically, well, they were not the ziggurat, but they were typically over to the side. This is a typical city in Babylon, in the Babylonian Empire. Here you see an example of a ziggurat, and the temple, here's the temple, it's off to the side. It's where the worship happens, where the profane can come in and pay their respects to the god. So there's a little bit of immediate context in our background here. Once again is the chronicle, a Babylonian chronicle that we studied in the first part. Once again here also the gates of Ishtar. Last week we talked about, of course, the idol that was seen in that Daniel interpreted. And I think he didn't really interpret it. He gave the king the dream. Remember, the king had no. Let's see here. We didn't do our quick review of that last week. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar? One evening he dreamed dreams. And those dreams, maybe he forgot those dreams. I was making the case last week that I don't think he forgot those dreams. I think he had just taken over as king because his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had just died, or recently had died. So he had a court of people that he didn't choose. So it could be that in this case, he did have the dream, and he did remember the dream, but he wanted to test all these wise men that served his father to find out, are these guys really talented, gifted, astrologers, magicians, Chaldeans, or are they con men? Well, as it turns out, they were most likely con men because they couldn't give him anything. But Daniel was given the vision from God and took it to the king and saved a lot of people's necks in doing so. But none of Nebuchadnezzar's wise men were able to give him the dream. Then, of course, they didn't know it. They couldn't interpret it. Daniel not only gave him the dream back, but he interpreted it as well. And let's see. When Daniel learned about the death decree, all the astrologers and magicians were going to be killed. Daniel asked his boss to go ask the king, give us some time. I think I can help you out with this. And God revealed the vision to Daniel in a night vision, it says. So it could have been a dream, or it could have just been a vision that came at night. And Daniel praised God for giving him the vision and the interpretation. And of course, that dream was this. Daniel said that a great image. What did Daniel say the king saw in his dream? It was a great image, a head of fine gold, a breast and arms of silver, a belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. And a stone cut out without hands comes in, as you can see there. That's the little meteor that's behind there. And hits the statue at the bottom, and not only breaks it, but pulverizes it, dustifies it. And then a great mountain forms on that spot and grows and engulfs or encapsulates the entire world. And that represents the kingdom of Jesus Christ, that mountain. And of course, the way the text, the way it breaks down was the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar, and the Babylonian Empire, the chest and arms of silver being the Medo-Persian Empire with Cyrus the Great. After that, the bronze, the waist and thighs of bronze represent Alexander the Great, his conquest of the known world. And then the legs of iron represent the Roman Empire. Two versions of it. There's two, because it's split into east and west. Interesting, right? The two legs. It's really, really amazing stuff. And, of course, the feet and toes made of iron and miry clay, representing more likely the 10 divisions that cropped up after Rome had fallen. All right, so that's all we need to do there. Let's get into now the actual text of Daniel chapter. Here we go. Here's helps us out a little bit more. Those 10 kingdoms in just a traditional Protestant theology way to look at this is those 10 kingdoms. If the legs of iron are the Roman Empire, and the feet and toes of partly iron and partly clay, those 10 toes could represent what we now know to be Italy, France, England, Belgium, Holland, Portugal, Prussia, Austria, Spain, and Greece. Now, of course, it's more accurate to refer to those by their classical names, but that's just a quick way to go through that. Now, here we go. Last week we looked also at this chart, the vision of the statue of chapter 2, where we lay out the time frames of all of it. It all works out perfectly. And we'll be back on this chart next week with the vision of the tree that Nebuchadnezzar is going to have in chapter 4. Chapter 4, which is credited to Nebuchadnezzar himself as being the author of that chapter. So we'll see that next week. We'll come back to these things. So let's go ahead and get into our chapter for today. I'll leave the ziggurat up there. All right. There we go. Maybe we'll go over here to the big screen. Let's do that. Okay. Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we've all been brought up to speed. Now we know where we are. Last chapter ended with Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. So that's where everyone is. King is very pleased coming out of chapter 2 with Daniel specifically for giving him the interpretation of that dream. Not just the interpretation, but telling him what the dream was. And so everything seems to be okay as we head into chapter 3, but things go south quickly. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits. Now, this is not from chapter 2. This is, it's the image, the statue he's building is not necessarily the image that was seen in the dream. It could be. It makes sense that it would be because it follows right after. He's just had this dream where he's the head of gold and he's very proud about that. But this idol was most likely, as we'll read later, was most likely solid gold, head to toe. So he made this image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. That's about 90 feet tall. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the counselors, and treasurers. The KJV calls them the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, and the treasurers, and the counselors, and the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the princes and the governors and captains, the judges, the treasurers and counselors, and the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together into the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The way this reads is interesting. It reads a lot like, well, it seems to match ancient Near Eastern literature quite a bit because the way things are repeated in epithets, it has that feel of Epic of Gilgamesh. It seems to fit into the time in which it claims to be from. Verse 4, then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time or whenever you all hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you all fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso all does not fall down and worship shall the same hour, shall immediately be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, at that time when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Verse 8, wherefore at the time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of all these instruments and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, they pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that the 3 young men be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I've set up? Verse 15, now if you are ready, when you hear the sound, all this music, all these instruments and all this music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image that I've made, well, that's well and good. But if you do not, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? There we go. So how quickly has Nebuchadnezzar gone from amazed and in deference to the to the one true living God, Daniel's God. And now he's right back to his old tricks. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? He says. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king. Now, folks, let me just point out to you, what you're about to hear from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is this. You want this kind of faith. This is the kind of faith that you want in persecution. Listen to how they handle it. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Now, verse 18. Here, this is really the kicker. Verse 18. But if not, if he doesn't deliver us from your burning fiery furnace, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Even if, in other words, even if God wouldn't, even if God chose not to, I'm still not going to worship at any time. I'm not going to worship your idols. Verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against the three young men. He ordered the furnace heated to 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. These men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their outer garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated 7 times, as it said, which is probably an exaggeration, but anyway, the flame of the fire killed those men who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and threw them in the fire. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell, bound into the burning fiery furnace. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? Did we not cast 3 men who were tied up into this fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men who are not tied up, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. In the King James it says, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Of course, the underlying text here, being Aramaic, is the same. It's a matter of choice there. Verse 26, then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. There you go. Nebuchadnezzar has used the term Most High God. Come out and come here. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors began being gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was even a hair of their heads singed, neither were their clothes, their coats changed, nor the smell of fire. They didn't even smell like smoke when they came out of there. And no smell of fire had come upon them. Verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. And then Nebuchadnezzar says, therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that would be Yahweh, shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. And then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So they just received their second promotion. That's the end of chapter 3. And it ends, of course, the roller coaster ride continues, facing death, being delivered by God, and Nebuchadnezzar once again saying, okay, your God is real. But of course, Nebuchadnezzar struggles with pride. So he has no true faith. Not yet, anyway. Just keep your fingers crossed for Nebuchadnezzar as we continue. All right. So there's the text. Now let's look at some highlights in there. We want to look just to get some understanding about what we've just read. Back here from up here at verse 1. Much like in chapter 2, this story focuses on Nebuchadnezzar and an image or statue made of metal, although in this story the image is real and is made entirely of gold. Though the text isn't clear, the statue may represent the king or, more likely, one of his gods, probably Marduk, because of the statements, fall down and worship and serve your gods. Logically, it could have been, of course, Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. The statue's seemingly disproportionate height, 60 cubits, which is 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, may suggest it was placed on some hill or platform. It stood on the plain of Dura, as we saw in the text. Apparently, this is located southeast of Babylon. Now, here's what's interesting. Here's archaeology for you. A French expedition in the 19th century AD reported finding numerous mounds there in what appeared to be the base for a great statue. Interesting. Now, I guess about this herald and this music. The herald and the orchestra would befit a Babylonian court function: the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe. 3 of these terms come from Greek. And this caused some to argue the writing of Daniel must date after the conquests of Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BC. However, the Greek words come from the Aeolic or Doric Greek dialects, not the Attic dialect common after Alexander's conquests. This supports a date of writing that is earlier than Alexander, which once again supports the prophetic nature of the book of Daniel. Now, what about the burning fiery furnace? This furnace may have been used to cast the metal for the statue, or perhaps was one of numerous large furnaces used to produce the estimated 15 million kiln-fired, that's a tough word to say. Or there could have been a lot of furnaces around there that were used to produce these 15 million bricks that were needed for Nebuchadnezzar's many building projects in the capital. Now, these Chaldeans, these young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were maliciously, perhaps falsely, certainly, I don't know if they were falsely, but they were maliciously accused. Perhaps the Chaldeans resented the promotions that had been given to these Hebrew foreigners at the end of chapter 2. So much like in chapter 6 coming up, the jealous officials trapped the king with his own decree in order to get rid of their rivals. So, folks, this is just politics. It's just politics. And we see it played out today. How soon until they start throwing Trump supporters into a fiery furnace? Maybe not that long. But curiously, Daniel is not here with his friends, so he doesn't stand accused as they do. If he was present at the ceremony, the Chaldeans may not have challenged Daniel because he had too much power. Or perhaps they didn't because he actually bowed before the image, which is not likely because it doesn't fit his character. or anything else he does throughout the text. Even more likely, Daniel was not present because he was traveling perhaps on royal business, or was exempt from the summons since he served primarily at the royal court in Babylon. So he was probably, it could be that he was too high on the totem pole, so to speak. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar responds with anger to this direct disobedience by the three. He orders the furnace be heated to 7 times more than usual. This is likely an exaggeration. For instance, you remember back when Daniel and his 3 friends told their boss, their keeper, Arioch, that they did not want to eat the king's food. They wanted to eat just their regular diet of vegetables. And at the end of the trial period, the text said that these young men looked 10 times better than the rest, which is an exaggeration. But it makes a point, right? And so it could be the same type of literary device, a little exaggeration. Just all it really means is that this furnace is hotter than it usually is, by a lot. But of course, using the number 7 is interesting because it is the number of completeness. And it could be used in this sense, simply to suggest that it's extremely hot. Although the 3 Hebrews were unharmed by the flames, the fire killed the men who cast them in it, showing that the danger was quite real. Now, what's interesting about here, let's talk for a second about the Apocrypha. The term Apocrypha comes from the Greek words meaning obscure or hidden and usually refers to works of disputed authority. Apocrypha is typically used of a number, the word Apocrypha is typically used of a number of additional chapters and books included in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, which was followed by some branches of the Christian Church, the Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. It includes additions to the canonical books of Daniel, specifically the Prayer of Azariah and the Song of the 3 Children in chapter 3, plus the stories of Susanna and Bel and the Dragon in chapters 13 and 14, which of course are not part of the canon. Chapters 13 and 14, that would be where you get Bel and the Dragon. And of course, these stories show up in Esther as well. Most apocryphal works are separate books. But when the Jews determined which books were of prophetic origin, they deemed the apocryphal works as helpful, but not inspired, and thus not canonical. When the scholar Jerome translated the Old Testament and New Testament into Latin for the Catholic Church in about AD 400, he included these additional books but called them apocryphal. At the time of the Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century, reformers excluded from their Old Testament anything not in the original Jewish canon. So there's an answer if you've ever had the question, how did they decide what went in? How did they decide what to put in as the Old Testament? Well, there you go. Whatever was part of the Jewish canon seemed to be the choice. But at the Council of Trent in around 1546, the Roman Catholic Church declared the Apocrypha as fully authoritative scripture. Now, of course, once again here we see the king promoting Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In other words, these Daniel and his 3 friends, just like Joseph, who the Bible says nothing bad about. A couple of the only characters this happens to, Daniel and Joseph. Nothing bad is said about them in Scripture. They seem to have led exemplary lives, and which is difficult for many of us to think they were given positions in the pagan empire. Interesting. And as we read the book of Daniel, we'll get a sense of how did Daniel respond to being given this position? Did he remain humble? Did he throw his power around? How did Daniel use the opportunity? In this story, God rescues and blesses 3 faithful Hebrews for their courageous refusal to practice idolatry before the Babylonian king. The story challenges other Hebrews to remain faithful despite the current power of the pagan Babylonians and later Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Although God would not always rescue his people when they took courageous stands before powerful pagan overlords, they needed to take those stands nonetheless. All right, so a couple more. Let's bring it back over here to the main screen. There we go. Now, more about the image. Nebuchadnezzar's confession of God did not prevent him from being a worshiper of idols. Besides, ancient idolaters thought that each nation had its own gods, and that in addition to these, foreign gods might be worshipped. The Jewish religion was the only exclusive one that claimed all homage for Jehovah as the one true God. All right, guys. It looks like I'm not online over here. So out there in the chat, I'm just having a little problem with my software here. Out there in the chat, if you're still seeing me and hearing me, just give me a little thumbs up, or just let me know out there in the chat. I'm looking at the chat right now. There we go. It seems like we're back on here. Okay, cool. Thanks, Miss Ostrich. Thanks, Alyssa. That's weird. Streamlabs is weird lately. Anyway, the Jewish religion was the only exclusive one that claimed all homage for Jehovah as the one and only true and living God. Men will, in times of trouble, confess God if they're allowed to retain their favorite idols. That's just like us today. The image was that of Bel, or in their language, Baal, the Babylonian tutelary god, or rather, it could have been Nebuchadnezzar himself as the personification and representative of the Babylonian Empire, as suggested to him by the dream. Thou art this head of gold. The interval between the dream and the event here, the furnace, was about 19 years. So we're thinking, okay, let's just round it to 20 years. So from the time Daniel interprets the dream, they've spent 20 years together as being sort of rulers in Babylon. And so they had a lot of time to get to know each other, and Nebuchadnezzar still threw him in the fire. Nebuchadnezzar had just returned from finishing the Jewish and Syrian wars, spoils of which would furnish the means of rearing such a colossal statue. The colossal size makes it likely that the frame was wood, overlaid with gold. The height, 60 cubits, is so out of proportion with the breadth, exceeding it by 10 times, that it seems best to suppose the thickness from breast to back to be intended, which is exactly the right proportion of a well-formed man. The 60 cubits could refer to the image and pedestal together, the image being 27 cubits high or 40 feet, the pedestal 33 cubits or 50 feet. Confirms this by mentioning, actually the historian Herodotus confirms this by mentioning a similar image 40 feet high in the temple of Belus at Babylon. It was not the same image, because the one here was on the plain of Dura, not in the city. No other nation but the Jews would feel this edict oppressive. Whenever the king said, when you hear this music, whenever the band starts playing the music, whenever that is, any point during the day, you have to stop what you're doing. and get on your knees and bow to the idol. But of course, to the Jews, this would feel oppressive. But it did not prevent them from worshiping their own God. Interestingly, it was evidently aimed at the Jews by those jealous of their high position in the king's court. So it's another theory there. The text doesn't give us that immediately there, but it makes sense that these guys were not happy with these 4 Hebrews who had found favor with the king, and so they probably tried to destroy them over and over. They will know from the text itself coming up soon in the next couple of chapters where they absolutely do try to force the king's hand to kill these people, to kill these young men. The literal image of Nebuchadnezzar is a typical prophecy of the image of the beast, connected with mystical or mystery Babylon in Revelation 13:14. The second mystical beast there causes the earth and them that dwell in it to worship the first beast, and that, as many would not, should be killed. Okay, let's see. I think that's all I've got over here for you. Yeah, this like the Son of God. That's what like this term. The KJV says like the Son of God, and then other translations say like sons, like a son of the gods. Unconsciously, like Saul, Caiaphas, and Pilate, he is made to utter divine truths. Son of God in his mouth means only an angel from heaven, as Daniel 3:28 proves. Compare Job, chapter 1, verse 6, chapter 38, verse 7, Psalm 34, 7 and 8, and the probably heathen centurion's exclamation from Matthew chapter 27, verse 24. The Chaldeans believed in families of gods. Baal, the supreme god, accompanied by the goddess Malita, being the father of the gods. Thus the expression he meant one sprung from and sent by the gods. Really, it was the messenger of the covenant, who herein gave a prelude to his incarnation. Now, of course, the term Most High God here again, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges Jehovah to be supreme above other gods. Not that he ceased to believe in his others. So he returns to his original confession. Your God is a God of gods, which he said also in Daniel chapter 2, verse 47, from which he had swerved in the interim. Perhaps drunk on power once again from taking Jerusalem, whose God he therefore thought unable to defend it. Now, when they came out, it's interesting too, when they came out of the furnace, it said there was no smell of fire on them. Think of that in a spiritual context. You know, when you go somewhere, just think, you know, if you go and you hang out in a club or a bar, which I don't think anybody can do right now, but you do, just follow along with me. You come out, well, you know, maybe not today, but you come out of there smelling funny. Years ago, you would come out of there smelling like cigarette smoke. Today, you might come out of there smelling like who knows what. But it's kind of an interesting point. Wherever you go, you get stuff all over you. So you want to be careful where you go because you don't want to come out stinking, right? You don't want to come out smelling like fire. You don't want to come out with that smell of smoke all over you. All right, now let's get into the Chris White commentary here, which is an interesting take at the book of Daniel. And we're going to start back at the beginning of the chapter. In chapter 3, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king, of course, made the image of gold. We don't really know when this happened, other than it was after Daniel's companions were promoted to their positions of authority, which occurred after Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We know this because we see that the other wise men make references to their promotion in verse 12. And they seem to be jealous of it. Let's do this. Let's use this for right now, since we're talking about, it's not the same, but it gives us an idea. Now, Nebuchadnezzar made an image. He made an idol. You could assume that this statue was the likeness of Nebuchadnezzar himself. I always assumed that that's what the statue was, but there's really nothing in the text that tells us that it is. In no place does the text say that it was made to look like Nebuchadnezzar. Instead, it always uses the phrase, the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. This or a similar phrase is said 8 times in this chapter. This is the only connection to Nebuchadnezzar it has, that is, that it was set up by him. It also seems to directly refute the idea that it was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself in verse 14, which says Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up?" The idea is further refuted by noting that the Babylonians did not seem to have a concept of the divine king. So, as we think about the ancient Near East, once again, in Egypt, the Pharaoh was a living God. That's what Pharaoh meant, God-man. But in Babylon, it's a little different. The king is a man. He's not a god, but he's the representative of the god. Of course, that's what the ziggurat is there, to be a home for the god, in this case, probably Marduk. In Egypt, the pyramid was probably, I don't know for sure, but probably a burial tomb. There's some other interesting ideas about pyramids, but we won't get into that today. It seems here that what was being asked of these young men was from Nebuchadnezzar was that he wanted them to serve his gods. The image that he set up was apparently for this purpose. There's no indication that there was any other way for them to serve his gods other than the worshiping of the image he set up. Also in verse 28, when Nebuchadnezzar ends up giving them praise for not giving in to his commandment, this is after they come out of the furnace, it suggests that it was about the worship of a god. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own." This was impressive. This was impressive to the king. You know, when you've got somebody like a king, or he's been royal all his life, most of your life you have people telling you telling you what you want to hear. Nobody will stand up to you. So when someone stands up to you, one of two things that happen: they'll just immediately kill you, or you'll be impressed by it. Clearly, he wasn't convinced when they didn't worship the idol, but when Nebuchadnezzar saw him come out of that fire unharmed, he was quite impressed. So this was a test of loyalty for these 3 young men, probably at this time, probably in their 30s. It might be safe to say they were in their 30s, or at least 30 years old. It's 20 years after Daniel interprets the dream. This is a test of loyalty given only to the state employees, and it was considered a loyalty to the gods of Babylon. It was a test that was probably designed specifically to expose these 3 Jewish men, or Jews in general, as they could not, as good Jewish men, bow down to a false god without disobeying the covenant. It's clear that from the verses these first few verses, that Nebuchadnezzar considered the worship and service of his gods to be the point of this particular test. Again, there's no indication in the Bible or in the historical record that Nebuchadnezzar considered himself to be a god or even solicited worship of himself. Now, where this statue was, the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. This was probably about 15 or 20 miles outside the city. So it may explain why this event could have been an unexpected surprise for these officials, which would seem to be necessary if it was indeed a test of their loyalty to the Babylonian gods. It's also close enough, that is, it was in the province of Babylon, so that Nebuchadnezzar's decree for them all to leave the city and come to this place would have been able to be done relatively quickly. This is also one possible argument as to the reason Daniel was not here during this story. Some scholars point out that the last verse of the chapter before this, Daniel chapter 2, verse 49, is meant to explain his absence, where it says here, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. In other words, the scholars say that this verse was intended by Daniel to explain his absence from the next event. That is, since he was to remain at the royal court, it would mean that he was still in the city taking care of official business in the absence of the king who had gone to the plain of Dura. Other explanations for Daniel's absence may be that since he was such a high official in the government, perhaps he was on official duty in a foreign land. So there's that thought too. Now we hear the term peoples, nations, and languages. Then a herald cried out, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages." This shows the Babylonian government was multinational, multicultural, but multinational. It was a multinational one, though the herald probably spoke to them all in Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the day. In the next verse, he more clearly explains the situation to them in Daniel 3:6, where he says, "And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." It appears that there was a furnace built within view of the statue. Such furnaces have been discovered by archaeologists in Babylon, and they were huge. These things that they have found were enormous, often built into the side of a hill, so no one could walk up to the top of it and throw things down in it. They had another door on the side at ground level as well. They even know that these furnaces were used for executions in those times. So it's just read a bit ago in the scholarly article where it says it wasn't common in the ancient Near East to throw people into a furnace. Now, burning with fire, that became executing people with fire was pretty common, but not throwing them into a furnace. But here, once again, we're finding out that perhaps in Babylon, perhaps it may have been more of a regular practice. So they may have been an outlier in that respect. There was probably a temptation to fall down. They may have made excuses like, well, maybe we can just act like we're worshiping, but in our heart we want. Just think of yourself if that happened here, and you're a Christian, and suddenly the government says, listen, at 3 p.m. every day, everyone stops what you're doing, and you get down on your knees, and you worship, I don't know, the Statue of Liberty, or the flag, even. And we're talking about worship here. We're not talking about pledges or anything. We're talking about worship. What if that kind of decree came down? What would you do? And of course, and they said behind that, and if you don't do it, and we catch you, you will be killed. What would you do? Would you bow down? Would you bow down and not really be in your mind? What would you do? Or would you just refuse? It's a test of faith. That's why this story is so important right now, to go through it. We're told by the Lord that though we should make every effort to flee and avoid situations like this, if we are ever caught in a situation where we are required to choose to deny Christ or die, we are called to die. Might not be comfortable, might not be what everyone wants to hear, but there it is. But folks, listen, if Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, then this is not all there is. If Jesus Christ rose from the dead, then eternal life is ours, for those of us who follow him. So don't be too put off by the fact that we're called. We're called to die. If this happens, if something like this happens, if we're ever caught in a situation where we are required to choose to deny Christ or die, we're called to die. If you end up in the hands of some Boko Haram Muslim terrorist group, and they put a gun to your head and say, deny Christ or die, well, you can rest assured, folks, the Lord would have a blessing for you and yours. The Lord was very serious about this aspect of our discipleship. We are expected to count the cost that our following him may require our lives. I believe we're also told to expect it to happen in the end times, in which Christians will be massively persecuted just before the rapture. All right, now we're at now it says in verse 8, chapter 3, verse 8, it says, therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. This word here, Chaldeans, we talked about it last week, is in other translations called astrologers. The area called Chaldea, and there were people from the area called the Chaldeans, but specifically here in this iteration of the Babylonian Empire, the term Chaldeans is also a job description, and specifically it's astrologers, that type of job. In chapter 1, we mentioned some of the issues with this word and how it could be used both as an ethnic Babylonian person or a specific job in the occult administration, namely an astrologer. Basically, these were the people that Daniel was put in charge of in chapter 2 by Nebuchadnezzar. So once it gets strange, isn't it? Daniel was put in charge of the astrologers. These guys were probably jealous of Daniel and his friends because of their promotion, or perhaps they resented being governed by Jews, or both. And they might have put the king up to this whole idea in order to get rid of the Jewish men. There is circumstantial evidence for this. For example, in Daniel chapter 6, this is exactly what happened. These occultists that Daniel was in charge of learned enough about Daniel and his God to come up with a scheme which they convinced Darius, of which was similar to this one, in that the only people that could ever be found guilty of it would be the Jews. So we see that happen later on when we get into when we get down to the area of the silver there, when we get to the Medo-Persians come in and take over Babylon. The same is true for this situation. It's not surprising that everyone on the plain of Dura bowed down that day, not just because of the furnace situation, but because in a polytheistic society there was nothing wrong with bowing to other gods that you may or may not know. The more gods you worship, the more bases you covered, so to speak. That sounds a lot like the New Age movement today, with all its ascended masters and theosophy, that kind of thinking. There were certainly no people other than the Jews who would consider dying rather than worshiping another god. It would seem that whoever came up with this scheme had to have the Jews in mind, and this seems to be confirmed in the next few verses after this, as we go to verses 9 through 12. And they spoke and said to the king, O king, live forever. You've made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of all the music shall fall down and worship the gold image, and whoever does not will be cast into the fiery furnace. So first, these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods. So first, these men remind the king of his oath to kill anyone who didn't do this, to kill anyone who didn't worship the idol. They remind him that you wrote this, you gave this order. And this may be because they knew Nebuchadnezzar liked these guys, which is another reason they probably resented them. And so they may have thought he might not be inclined to kill them. There are a few things that give us a reason to suspect these men as having planned this entire thing, as in the case of Daniel 6, or at least planned how to take advantage of the situation. They mention that these men are Jews in verse 12. They also mention that Nebuchadnezzar appointed them to high positions. They remembered this event and cited the job promotion, the very thing that Daniel chapter 6 tells us was the reason they plotted a similar event to kill Daniel. And that is jealous ambition, or just plain old politics, right? Sorry, I still haven't taken care of the squeaking in this chair. I'll get to that. Verses 13 through 15, then Nebuchadnezzar in rage and fury gave the command to bring these young men to him. And he called them onto the carpet and took them to task. Hey, listen, if you'll just bow down to this idol, everything will be okay. But if you don't, I'm going to have to throw you in this fire, in this furnace. So they brought them before the king. This is all probably taking place out on the plain of Dura. It may be a distinct place where the king was, perhaps a royal tent or some other structure. It appears that the king is making an exception for these three men, because verse 6 says that whoever did not worship would be immediately cast into the fire, into the furnace. It also seems as though he is making sure to confirm this with them, as opposed to taking it on hearsay, which means that Nebuchadnezzar did not himself see them refuse. This possible special treatment may have been because he remembered them and was impressed by their work, which you could say is the case based on an upcoming verse. But he certainly is not happy about it. Verse 4 uses the words rage and fury to describe Nebuchadnezzar's disposition. And then Nebuchadnezzar says that phrase, and who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? No one can hear you scream out here on the plains of Dura. Who's going to save you out here? I'm in charge, said Nebuchadnezzar. So when Nebuchadnezzar says this, it may be an indication that he was aware their God was Yahweh. It would be very improbable, no matter how many people he saw a day, that he would have not remembered these guys, at least by now, when reminders of who they were had been offered. The subject of Yahweh most likely had come up often in connection to the Jews, and even specifically Daniel and these guys. So Nebuchadnezzar may be specifically saying to them, look guys, even your God can't help you with what I'm about to do to you. Nebuchadnezzar obviously didn't know much about Yahweh at this point. Or it could be, as many say, that he was being intentionally blasphemous at this point. Author David Guzik says the following: this was an even greater test for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's one thing to make a stand for God. It is a greater thing to stick to your stand when you're pointedly asked to do it. Peter could follow Jesus after his arrest, but he wilted and denied Jesus when he was asked, is it true? In chapter 3, verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. It's one of my favorite passages in the book, where they just tell him, we have no need to respond to you on this. Our God will deliver us. We have a personal relationship with our God. He indwells us. Author Stephen Miller says of their answer, the answer says, we have no need to answer you in this matter. He says, no apology was to be given for the stand they took. Remember, folks, this is the application to our lives here today. Anything you do in the name of Jesus, make sure it's really in the name of Jesus and you're not just using that. Make sure. But no, anything we do in the name of Jesus, you need not apologize for. No apology, in this case, no apology was to be given for the stand they were taking. This was not a proud reply. When they said, we have no need to answer you on this matter, not necessarily, not a proud reply. It was a firm, confident, faithful reply. Their minds were made up. They know God. They have a personal relationship with God. That's why they can be so confident. And you can have that too. Maybe you're new here. Maybe you're not a Christian. Maybe you're just checking this stuff out. You come see what these crazy Christians are talking about. You also can have that kind of resolve. That's what the Holy Spirit does for you. So anyway, they look around at Nebuchadnezzar's ragtime band, all the musicians probably looking at them as they played, and they said to the court, you don't need to do all this. We can go ahead and give you our answer. See, the king had brought the band around and said, okay, go ahead and play the music and give these guys a chance to go ahead and bow down so we can get them off the hook. These guys, you don't need to do all this. Go ahead and give you our answer. We're not doing it. And they gave one of the best answers of all time. In verses 17 and 18. If that is the case, if you're going to throw us in the fire, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, even if he doesn't, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Now, when they said, if that be the case, here in, let's see, where was that? That was back here in verse 17. Yes, if that is the case. Once again from author David Guzik. He says, our God is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, either to prevent their being cast into it or to preserve them unhurt in it, and to bring them safe out of it. Instances of his power in other cases, such as the passage of the Israelites through the Red Sea safely, when their enemies were drowned, and with others, confirmed their faith in this. And he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. They might have a well-grounded hope and persuasion of deliverance, arising partly from former instances of the divine power and goodness in such like cases, and partly from the consideration of the glory of God, which would be greatly conspicuous herein, and chiefly because of the king's defiance of God and blasphemy against him, when he said, what God can save you from me? Which they had reason to believe would be taken notice of, because it does not appear that they had any foresight of certain deliverance. They didn't know for sure that God would pull them out of the fire. It might be God's will for them to die in that fire. They were aware of both. But we don't have any reason to believe they had any specific foresight that they would be delivered out of the fire, or any secret intimation of it to them, or a full assurance of it, as is evident by what follows. They did not doubt God's ability, but neither did they presume to know God's will. Very important. They did not doubt God's ability, but neither did they presume to know God's will. In this they agreed with Job. Job said in chapter 13, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. They recognized that God's plan might be different than their desires. You and I, we have our own desires and dreams. And our prayer My prayer is that God fulfills them. But if he doesn't, we don't turn back on it, because we can't pretend to know every detail of his will. Ned's with us. Thanks, Ned's. I appreciate that, brother. Thank you very much. Ned has used the super chat option. He says, great lesson, Holy Spirit-driven lesson. Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. Glory be to God, the King over all things. Grab some chicken. I appreciate that, guy. That's a good idea, too. Getting hungry. It's dinner time. Thanks, Ned. I appreciate that, brother. Thank you. So we know from several passages in the Bible and from history that it is sometimes God's desire for believers to be martyred. It's just the truth. We even see in Revelation chapter 6 that God waits to judge the world specifically until more martyrs are killed. God has his purposes. This is also why he tells us not to think of what we will say as our last words, but that he will say them for us. There's a comfort, folks. This whole thing about being martyred, that we said earlier, in hypothetical, what if you were asked to deny Christ? Why should that not bother you or worry you? Because we have faith. Faith in God that he is reliable. And because he's reliable, our faith has evidence. There's evidence. There's reason to have faith because God is reliable. And in this, we can know that if we're asked to be martyred at some point, or if it comes down to that, I wouldn't worry too much about pain or agony or going through any or actually experiencing any kind of torture. Because when we hear the stories, at least in the first, second century, of Christians being persecuted, being crucified, being burned at the stake, being torn apart by lions, the reports we get are that these people were singing hymns. They were singing hymns. And then they say to the king, but if not, even if he doesn't pull us out of this, but if not, is a stinging rebuke to the word of faith movement. Right? Listen to this. This is very good. Right here from the book of Daniel, chapter 3, we get a full rebuke of the word of faith movement. You're not called to be healthy and wealthy and happy here. You're called to follow Jesus. Now, following Jesus can lead you into that, but you don't judge your faith on how healthy and wealthy and happy you are. You don't judge how true the gospel is by how wealthy and healthy you are. But that's the word of faith movement. So this but if not rebuke is a stinging rebuke to the word of faith movement here in chapter 3. The idea that any lack of answered prayer is because of your lack of faith rather than the will of God. That's silliness. These men are listed in the so-called Hall of Faith in the book of Hebrews, Daniel and his three friends. But you can see that they were unsure if God was actually going to save them or not. As we would probably be. Not sure whether it's God's will to pull me out of this bad situation or not. If it is, that's great. If not, it's God's will. That's our attitude. They realize that sometimes it's God's will not to answer their prayers. They would be considered to have a lack of faith by the modern word of faith movement, Joel Osteen and the like, because they weren't claiming. They weren't claiming the deliverance. They weren't claiming it themselves. This is similar to Paul with that thorn in his flesh that he talked about, or Jesus in the garden praying for let this cup pass from me. Let's take this away from me if possible. They all said, in effect, not my will, but your will, to God. Then in verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury. An expression on his face changed toward these young men. And he spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace way more, 7 times more than usual. So the king was really irked. He was angry. The expression on his face changed, it said, and he was full of fury. He orders something in his anger here that he will come to regret. That is the heating up of the furnace past its normal operating temperature. Miller quotes another scholar about the phrase here. He's 7 times hotter. He says, Baldwin points out that 7 times is a proverbial expression and cites Proverbs 24:16 and Proverbs 26:16 as examples. Hartman calls this an idiomatic way of saying as hot as possible. And he seems to be correct. Thus, the expression signifies that the furnace was heated to its maximum intensity, just as hot as you could get it without it burning itself up. So then we go to verses 20 through 23, and he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the fire. These men were bound in their coats. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent, the furnace was exceedingly hot, and the flame of fire killed those men who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up there. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now, and then, of course, God delivers his servants. In verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, Did we not put 3 men? Did we not put 3 men in there? Because, well, they answer him and say, yeah, that's true, we did. So Nebuchadnezzar gets confirmation, yes, we only put 3 men in there, because he's seeing something different. In verse 25, he says, Look, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th one is like the Son of God. This is almost certainly a Christophany. Many people, there's debate about this. A Christophany, in other words, an appearance of Christ before the incarnation. There's debate on this back and forth. So I wouldn't be dogmatic on this. It's just a very interesting concept to study. So a Christophany would be an appearance of Christ. So many argue that that's what this is, which is an appearance of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. Specifically, a Christophany is an appearance of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. And there's a lot of good lessons to be learned from it. The idea that in the time of fiery trial in your life, Jesus will be there with you. It is a temptation when trials come to get angry with God and move away from him. But if we decide to use the trial as a reason to draw closer to God, he will be nearer to us than ever before. There's another cause for comfort, folks. Chris White writes here, he says, I often think of that famous Footsteps poem where God carries you in your times of trouble. When you are at your worst, God is at his best. But we must not run away from him in troubles, but to him. It has been said that sometimes God does not want to yank you out of trials. He wants to go through them with you. Interesting, right? That's exactly the metaphor that we see for what happens to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's a perfect metaphor for that. Sometimes God doesn't want to pull you out of a trial. He wants to go through them with you. He's sharpening you. He's sanctifying you. Tried in the flames of affliction, right? That's how it goes. He wants to use these things to break the things that bind you. As we see these men also had only their bindings loosed from the fire and nothing else. Their bindings were gone, but their clothes weren't touched, and they had no smell of fire on them. Now, the translation of Son of God as to what Nebuchadnezzar said he saw in the fire with them is probably a bad translation, according to many traditional and conservative scholars that we've read. But of course, there are disagreements about this. Once again, this use of the term "son of God" or a son of the gods, or it's a debated term. Chris White here says, I agree with those that say this phrase is probably referring to a member of the divine council, or so-called sons of God. Now that is a minority view. That's not the prevailing viewpoint. The Babylonian religion had a huge emphasis on the so-called divine council. Much of their mythology dealt with what we would call the sons of God, or high-ranking angels from Genesis chapter 6. There are large numbers of parallels between their stories and the stories in the Bible. Dr. Michael Heiser points out that a certain number of the sons of God in their mythology became confined to the underworld, while another number remained in heaven, though the reason for this is not stated in their mythology. Their version of the sons of God were also involved in a mixing of angels and human beings and creating unnatural offspring, which resulted in a flood being sent. It's an interesting point there, because when we see the term Nephilim being used, it's not speaking of the fallen angels, it's speaking of the product of the fallen angels and the women, the daughters of men. That product was called Nephilim, or Gigante, as it's. Basically, the Babylonians had a sort of shady understanding of the truth. But the bad part is that their culture, they worshipped the created beings rather than the creator. And that is how we identify idolatry. Anything that's worshipped, that's created, is an idol. Because there's only one uncreated being. Now, in verses 26 through 27, Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke to the three men, servants of the Most High God, "Come out and come here." And then they did. And nothing was wrong with them. They were not hurt. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Servants of the Most High God is what Nebuchadnezzar called them. Even before they are out of the furnace, Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that these men serve the Most High God. Later on, when we get to chapter 7, I'm going to show you something about that term, Most High God. The underlying text, there's a couple different terms that are translated into what we say as Most High God. One of them that we'll find later in chapter 7 is Elyonin. And what's interesting about it is that it's a plural term, the same as Elohim. When we get there, we'll talk about that when we get there. It's just another interesting proof, another interesting example of the concept of the Trinity being expressed in the Old Testament. Now, once again, when there is debate, not about the Trinity being in the Old Testament, but there is debate about whether or not these terms are speaking of the Trinity or whether they're speaking of some divine council, which could be angels. It's not clear. You can read more from Michael Heiser to get a better grasp about that. But anyway, here these three Hebrews were experienced. They experienced literally the promise of when you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze, which comes from Isaiah 43:2. In verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own." Nebuchadnezzar is giving them praise for their conviction to disobey him here. Once again, I think that might have to do kind of, when you hear someone who's famous, well-known, or has a lot of people trying to get there, to spend time with them. People tend to tell you, you tend to be surrounded by yes men, people who just tell you what you want to hear. So you could see how it might be refreshing for the king to run into someone who doesn't do that and has a good reason for it. So Nebuchadnezzar's giving them praise for their conviction to disobey him here. He recognized that this was about their refusal to worship any god but Yahweh, and that he was trying to get them to do what he now knows Yahweh is not okay with at all. Now in verse 29, therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is Yahweh, shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. So Nebuchadnezzar perhaps still is a polytheist, but he's recognizing that, boy, this Yahweh seems to be the one on top. Nebuchadnezzar here makes it illegal to slight Yahweh, and such an offense would be upon the penalty of what seems to be Nebuchadnezzar's favorite punishment, that is, being cut into pieces and making their houses an ash heap. He's used that a couple times already. This could have been done by Nebuchadnezzar out of fear, as he recognized he had blasphemed this powerful God who obviously did exist and was serious. And this was perhaps his attempt to appease the true God. Now this and the next line could lead us to think that Nebuchadnezzar was onto these guys who were trying to plot against the Jewish men, these young Jewish men. A good boss knows about the office politics, right? And so a good leader has to know what the people underneath him are scheming and conniving about. This decree about not talking bad about the Jewish God may have been a way to prevent something similar from happening again. He does to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the next verse the very thing that seemed to anger the occultists the most. He promotes them for the second time. So these guys' plans are not working out. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 30, the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. It should be noted here that there was found a tablet that appears to confirm the names of these men as employees of the Babylonian Empire. Once again, archaeology showing that the Bible is historically accurate. A tablet found that appears to confirm the names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as well as two other Babylonian employees that are mentioned in the Bible. Guys known as Nebuzaradan, I think that's how it goes, and Nergal-Sharezer. Tough names. And both of these come, Nebuzaradan, Nebuzaradan, man, that's a tough one, comes from 2 Kings chapter 25 and Jeremiah 39 and Jeremiah 40. Nergal-Sharezer comes from Jeremiah chapter 39. So, more examples from archaeology where these people from the scriptures are shown to be real. They're real people. They were really there. They really lived. They really had a life. And these things that happened to them are recorded. Okay, now let's do we've come to the, let me get your outline back up here for you. Gosh, this chair. Oh, it's over here. There we go. All right, so we've gone through our part 3 here, our context, our scripture. We've got all that. Now we're into let's do our review. In every chapter of Daniel thus far, we've seen the great controversy, this controversy between Satan and God. We've seen it in every chapter so far. In chapter 1, the issue was obedience to God versus obedience to man. In chapter 2, we are shown that God will ultimately triumph in this controversy. In chapter 3, we're introduced to the other main issue in the book of Daniel, over which there is conflict, the issues of worship. Here we have an attempt to impose false worship. We see 3 Hebrew youths standing firmly for God when the whole world worships falsely. That's a good point. When the whole world's worshiping falsely, and they're having a great time doing it, and it looks like everything's perfect, what will you do? Remember, the stories in the book of Daniel illustrate the crisis that God's people will experience at the close of Earth's history. Daniel's 3 friends were tempted to worship falsely in ancient Babylon, yet they resisted. Likewise, God's people in the last days will be commanded to worship falsely. Expect it. That's prophecy. If it happens to us, that's what it'll be. We'll be commanded to worship falsely. We'll be commanded to break our loyalty to God. But followers of Jesus will refuse. We will have, if it's us, with such a solid relationship with God that no one will be able to compel us to worship falsely. Now, the parallels between Daniel chapter 3 and Revelation chapter 13 are striking. The events of Daniel 3 occurred several years after those of chapter 2. Remember, it was like about 20 years between Daniel's vision of the dream that he gave to the king and the fiery furnace. About 20 years in between those. Although chapter 2 ends with Nebuchadnezzar apparently beginning to follow the true God, chapter 3 provides evidence that he no longer is doing so. Nebuchadnezzar, like many of us, slipped back into his former way. Yet, how patiently God waited, how patiently God was with Nebuchadnezzar, until ultimately you can make the case, which we'll see later on, that he ultimately does submit to the one true living God. And that'll be happening very soon in our study. Now, here in chapter 3, we had another image. What was this image that Nebuchadnezzar set up? And it was an image of gold whose height was 80 cubits. It was 90 feet high. Set up on the plain of Dura. In defiance of God, Nebuchadnezzar made an image all of gold to indicate his kingdom would last forever. That's what he was saying. This kingdom will last forever. This image was the opposite of the image of Daniel 2, which was made up of various metals and indicated a succession of empires. It was erected on the plains of Dura and would have been quite an imposing sight with its height. Of course, the image was dedicated, and all the princes and the governors and the captains and the judges and the treasurers and the counselors and the sheriffs and all the rulers were invited. Most key leaders in the realm of Babylon were invited to the dedication of this statue. There had recently been a rebellion in Babylon, and the king questioned the loyalty of his subjects. The king was really trying to find people who would be loyal to him, and he was having trouble because there were a lot of people around there who were not loyal to the king. They were just trying to save their own hides. The dedication of the image would be an opportunity for everyone in the realm to pledge their loyalty to the government. Not to bow down would be considered treason. So perhaps there were other Jews present here as well, but only 3 stood firm for God. Similar to today. You would see today. Of course, when the music played, everyone was commanded to worship this idol. If you notice here that false worship was the issue faced in this chapter, Daniel chapter 3, false worship. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego must have stood out very prominently when the entire crowd bowed down at the sound of the music. The only 3 people not bowing down. It would have been very easy to rationalize that they weren't really worshiping the image if they bowed down, that this would have shown their loyalty to the king. But they knew that loyalty to God was involved. Therefore, they would not bow down. Now, this is one of the reasons why, personally, I make the case that mark of the beast, well, will certainly have to do with loyalty. Whether or not it's a physical mark on your hand or your forehead, debates about that, it's symbolic, meaning that people say that the mark on your forehead is symbolic for your loyalty. And the mark on your hand is symbolic for your duties. So who are you loyal to and who do you serve? So it could be that. Or it could be literal marks on your forehead and hand. But the point behind all of it is loyalty. So to avoid the mark of the beast, there's only one thing you need to do. Remain loyal to God. Period. Don't worry about where it is or what it is. Is it coming tomorrow? Is it coming next week or 50 years from now? Just remain loyal to God, and it's not an issue for you. Once again, the followers of Jesus Christ, the people who use His Word as the foundation for their lives and view all things through the Christian worldview, you will not be fooled. You will not be fooled by any such things. You will not fall into the traps of giving your loyalty to someone other than God. For the three Hebrews to bow down and worship the golden image would be disobedience to a commandment of God. So if we notice that the issues of worship and obedience to the commandments of God are both illustrated in this story. Remember that the focal point of Daniel is the last days. Later on in the study, as we move on through here, we'll compare this chapter with the book of Revelation. We'll see that the time will come in the last days when true worship will be forbidden. It's kind of already here, is it not? True worship is forbidden. People will be commanded to worship contrary to God's commandments. But His people must remain obedient. Who will you be loyal to? Now, when the young men said, we're not careful to answer in this matter, we're not going to wait. We're going to tell you right now, we're not going to do it. We're not going to serve this idol. We're not going to serve any false gods. This expression simply means that they did not need long to think about what they wanted to do. Before they came to the plain of Dura, they had made the decision that they would not yield, no matter how they were threatened. Nothing could intimidate them to worship falsely. It's a great example. The book of Daniel is a beautiful example of faith, of trust, of loyalty in the midst of persecution of the worst kind. Obedience to God was more important than a display of loyalty to the king that involved false worship. Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from your fiery furnace. But even if He doesn't, we're still not going to fall down here and worship this idol. Now, what a tremendous testimony of faith this is. This is the key verse in the entire passage. If God delivered them, that would be fine. But if He didn't, they would still serve Him right up to the moment when they couldn't. Their faithfulness to God did not depend on their deliverance. Their faithfulness to God did not depend on whether or not He answered their prayers. That's the point. That's loyalty. There was not a selfish obedience to God, but an obedience that sprang from a principle. So it will be with God's people in the last days. Whether God delivers them from persecution or even certain death is not the key factor. The only thing that really matters is that they love God and are obedient to Him. Now, of course, as we look back here, note when the the Hebrews were thrown into the fiery furnace, the only thing destroyed was the ropes that bound them. Rather than harming them, the fire freed them. Interesting. Although 3 men were thrown into the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar saw 4. God did not free the 3 Hebrew youth from going through the fire, but he walked through the fire with them. That's the kind of God we serve. That's the one who created us. We may undergo many trials in our lives. There may be many difficulties, but the assurance of Scripture is that the Son of God walks with us through the fire. Don't fear. Don't fear the trials and the persecutions and the threats. If Jesus is walking with you, you're going to be all right. In the last days, when God's people go through the terrible trials that will come, they can have the same assurance that the 3 Hebrews had. And we can know that the Son of God will walk through the fire with us. And so when they emerged from the fire unscathed, not even a smell of smoke or fire on them, this experience gave Nebuchadnezzar a tremendous revelation of the true God. God is patiently working with Nebuchadnezzar. So here, once again, we see proof that God works patiently to win every human heart. After seeing this display of God's power, Nebuchadnezzar made a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Yahweh, shall be killed, cut in pieces, and their houses made a dunghill. Because there is no other God that can deliver like this, Nebuchadnezzar said. God must have smiled as Nebuchadnezzar made this decree. Surely he was happy that Nebuchadnezzar felt so strongly about him, but Nebuchadnezzar had much to learn. God does not accept forced worship. Keep that in mind. God does not accept forced worship. You're a free agent to decide. Even if the government decrees that everyone should worship God, for example, even if the government should demand that everyone should worship God, the only service acceptable to God is that which springs from a heart filled with love. God does not want people to worship him because the government says so, but only because they have fallen in love with Jesus Christ. Now, what happened to these 3 Hebrews in ancient Babylon is comparable to the events that will transpire in the last days, many people would argue. Revelation 13 pictures for us a parallel scene to Daniel chapter 3. Let's notice some similarities here. In Revelation 13, verses 11 and 12, what does the 2-horned beast command the people of earth to do? To worship the first beast. So the issue in the last days has to do with worshiping the beast. So this would be false worship. The command to false worship is a key thought in the books of Daniel and Revelation. Now, Revelation 13, after bringing fire down from heaven and performing other miracles, what does this beast declare the people should make? An image to the beast. Once again, in Revelation, an image is built. And of course, these people, the people are asked to worship this image. And what will happen to those who refuse to worship this image in Revelation 13? They will be killed. Now, what other restrictions would be placed upon those who refuse to worship the beast and receive his mark? Revelation 13, verses 16 and 17. They will not be able to buy or sell unless they have the mark. Now, we know that to be sealed by God means one thing, but to be marked by the beast would be the opposite. Economic restrictions and finally a death penalty are passed upon those who refuse to worship the image of the beast or receive the mark of the beast. So we can already see that the issues are identical to Daniel chapter 3. from Revelation 13. In both chapters, people are commanded to worship an image and are threatened with death, but they remain faithful to the commandments of God. So when the beast calls for people to worship its image, whom does God ask them to worship? Revelation 14, verse 7. Worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. The one that created it all. At the same time, a decree given to worship the image to the beast, God sends a message into all the world that calls people to worship the Creator. That's another way to know for sure whether or not you're on the right side of things. Is what you're called to worship or told to worship something that is created or uncreated? Timeless, spaceless, immaterial. The Creator. It's very simple. The issue of the last days is the same as the issue in Daniel's day, and that is the worshiping of God according to his commandments. And of course, from Revelation 15, where will those who get the victory over the beast and his image ultimately stand? On the sea of glass. Just as God had victorious people in Daniel's day, he will have a victorious people in the end time as well. Their concern will not be deliverance, but faithfulness to God. They will remain as true to him as did those three young Hebrews. They will serve God even in the face of death. All right, my friends, there we go. There's part 3 for you. I hope you're all enjoying the series. It is definitely a lot of work to put together, but it's really so much fun to present. I really love to do it. All right, so let me come over here to the chat, see what everybody's doing. Who do we have here with us? All right, let's scroll up here a minute. Let me read some chats here and see how everybody's doing today. There's Mike Nino is with us. Good to see you. Welcome. Welcome. Good to have you here. Mike Nino says, I really learned a lot from Brad in the chat section. Never knew these things because I ignored them. Well, that's great news, Mike Nino. It's great to have you here. Awfully glad that you're finding it useful and instructive in some way. That's the point. So that's great news. Thanks for that. That comment is a blessing for sure. Bronwyn Pinette is with us. Some new names here today. Welcome. It's good to see you. S.S. Stoltz is with us. Rob Tick. Of course, Ned is with us. Ned Levon Ayers. Ned Levon Prayers is with us. Nicholas and Bob D. There's Gloria Aquino. Good to see you out there. Gloria says, loyalty to the government, just like today. Isn't that true? I think we saw that a lot. I think we saw a lot of people that fell into a worshipful kind of stance for Donald Trump about 5 years ago and continued in that path, treating him like a savior, like a God on earth, like the God-man in many ways. It's just, they did. So we have to be careful of that stuff. There's Dank Bud. Dank Bud is with us. Dank Bud's got a good one. He says, I guess we were talking about the mark just a moment ago. He says, Dank Bud says, I think it's physical. How can they see how to buy or sell without a mark? Well, think of it this way. Those who are sealed by God and those who are marked by the beast. If it's about loyalty, then you have to imagine some kind of edict, some type of policy that would come down from government that would challenge you, that would challenge your loyalty. We see this going on today. The mask is kind of one of those things. It's not a mark of the beast, but it's kind of like that, because rather than truly a gesture that's meant to save lives, it's more of a gesture of submission. So you think of it like that. You could think of it in terms of that. That's now, how would you think about something like loyalty when it comes down to worship? Because that's ultimately what the mark is about. Those who worship the beast. And so, let's say, for example, COVID camps. You refuse to get a test, you refuse to get a vaccine, and maybe you tested positive or what, and they come and they take you and they put you in a facility, and they say, listen, you can go back out into society, but you have to give up your property, you have to accept universal basic income, and you have to be loyal to the state. In other words, now we worship the state. Okay. Everyone who's not willing to be loyal to that would be over here in this camp or encampment. And all those who are loyal to it would be out here in the world. Now, these people in the camp, they don't buy and sell because they have no money, they have no property, they don't have anything. They've just been segmented out of society because they are not loyal to whatever it is that the state has put forth. So just as an answer to Denk's point there, that might be one way that a mark of the beast could be expressed without having a physical mark, just depending on whether or not you're a part of the society any longer because of what a specific government or world government might require. So, there's ways to think of it like that, but who knows? We'll find out eventually. There's Miss Ostrich. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you being out there. Joseph Powell is with us. Good to see you, Joseph Powell. Thanks for being here. There's Vaylor. Vaylor is late. It's all right. We've got a rewind button for you. But thanks for being here. It's good to see you out there. From Jessica with Love is here. It's good to see you here too. Thanks for being here. Welcome. There goes Sniff. Objectivity Cave. Good to see you out there, brother. Thanks for being here. I see Sally Knowles is in the house. J.D. Belcourt also. And Bronwyn Panett is giving props to Unplug 'em, which I will echo. I love Unplug 'em as well. All right, folks. We're getting out of here in a little less. I'm going to make it under 3 hours today by a long shot. So maybe this study, I don't know. It doesn't seem to matter how long they are. Same amount of people watching. But so I hope you've enjoyed this today. I've enjoyed putting it together. I always love doing these Bible studies. And what we do on Sunday afternoons, we do a devotion. I call it a devotion, but sometimes it's not a devotion. We just take a topic and it's either straight from Scripture or something that we just something that we want to clarify, and we learn about what God wants us to learn from His Scripture, from His Word. So, and if you're new around here, on Tuesdays and Saturdays, we do the Armor of Truth radio show, which we're coming up on show number 80 now for Armor of Truth radio show. That's a twice-a-week podcast type of thing where we look at current events and try to discern truth from fiction. And we do that looking through the lens of the Christian worldview. That's how we do it. So 4 shows a week at the moment. The schedule may change once we get into next year. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. The only way it would change is I would be doing more. I wouldn't be doing any less. but we have to keep the workload to a level where we can produce good content and not just content for the sake of making videos. That's kind of cheap, I think. So right now the schedule works pretty good. I think it'll probably stay this way for a good long while. And I do really appreciate the support that comes from all of you. Just your views, clicking that like button helps out a whole lot. And I hope that if anything happens to this channel, for some reason, sometimes we talk about things here that aren't really all that popular with the platform. So we could disappear here at any time. If we disappear off the YouTube platform, the first place to look would be over at the Patreon platform, over at the Days of Noah YouTube. I don't know if the Days of Noah website, daysofnoah.com, there's a link in the description to the daysofnoah.com. You don't really need a link for that, but he's got forums over there. And that's in case I don't get a website, get myself a home, a website established before that time. But that's the goal, is to get a regular podcast out on all the podcasting platforms. That's in the works right now. And also establishing a simple website and perhaps a progressive web app where you can get notifications when the videos go live directly from the app. You could download the app, and we'll talk more about that as we go in the future. But that's some of the things we're working on here. That's what donations are going toward now. That's how we're putting donations that come in toward that. Also, I also received from one of our viewers, I won't say the name because I don't know. I didn't ask if I should, but I received a case of Bibles. Let me show you one of them. The day before yesterday, whenever it was, I received a case of Bibles. Look at this. King James Holy Bible. There you go. Beautiful, trustworthy, and timeless. A case of these. These are to be given out when I'm out handing out tracts and doing things like that. That's what these would be used for. So that was really nice, a real blessing, for someone to. So I mean, I know who it is, but I'm just don't want to say the name on the air because I don't know that I didn't ask first. But I mean, that's really kind, and that's the kind of things that are going on behind the scenes. There's all kinds of things going on here that we don't talk about very much because there's so much to cover here with what we do in the shows. But I wanted to share that with you because that was a real blessing to receive this week. To have well over 24 full. I thought it was just going to be New Testaments, but it's the whole Bible, all 66 books in there. And so just a real blessing. So I appreciate all of your support, and you guys who are watching and sharing videos. That's just as important. Just showing up here and watching and participating that way is just as important as anything else. So I do love and appreciate all of you very much. This is a blessing to be able to do this work every day. Could not do it without the grace of God, of course, and of course without your support, this couldn't happen. So God bless you, my friends. I appreciate you all very much, and we'll see you here live on Saturday at 4 p.m. unless I'm live with Days of Noah on Saturday. I don't know yet, but if I'm not on with Days of Noah, I'll be here on this channel at 4 p.m. Saturday. But I will be sure to let you guys know in the community section here on YouTube. Okay, my friends, God bless you. I'll see you on Saturday, one way or the other. See you next time, folks.